Welcome everyone to the Proseminar talks of the Early Greek Thinkers course. Ich bin ganz beschwingt, as we would say in German. There's a swing feel that I'm still riding on. It was really fantastic. It's incredible to see how from all walks of life people come together. Some who may have wanted to study philosophy but didn't, some who never wanted to study philosophy but somehow started to. And there's something that's sparked in them. And there's something that's sparked in me thanks to them and to the thoughts that they burst out of them, you can say. So I'm very taken, and I'm sure you will agree when you hear them. It was 2.5 hours of talks, really magnificent talks. So you'll hear them in a minute. I just mentioned this briefly. If you ever want to present, just sign up for one of the courses and you're good to go. There's always a pro seminar with every single course, so you can always also present something. And yeah, so I hope that you enjoy the talks and see you very soon.
Now we are, James. Go ahead.
Hi everyone. Thanks for being here. Look forward to hearing everyone's papers today. Mine is entitled Pointing Towards Christ, Prefigurations of Christian Teleology in the Early Greek Thinkers. Introduction. Antonio Gaudi once said that originality consists of returning to the origin. In this paper, I seek to explore how, in the ideas of the original early Greek thinkers, Anaximander, Parmenides, Empedocles, and Heraclitus, we can see intimations of the Christian theology which would one day come to form the inspiration for Gaudi's famous cathedral, the Sagrada Familia. Although the connections I make between the ideas of the early Greek thinkers and later Christian theology are something of an exercise in historicism on my part, and an inference that I cannot prove, I hope that, in the spirit of Parmenides, while my arguments may not be empirically verifiable, they make sense in terms of their own metaphysical logic and underpinning axioms. So to get into things, the boundless. The first of the early Greek thinkers whose influence on Christian thought I wish to explore is Anaximander, since it is with him that we have an early development of the idea of natural law. For Anaximander, the balance of nature with its extremes of hot and cold seasons, for example, which begin to shift from one to the other just as they reach their highest points, is a form of, quote, justice and reparation to one another, for their injustice is in accordance with the ordinance of time, he says. It is also with Anaximander that we learn of the concept of the boundless, a certain something which is outside of nature, but is the grounding source of all heaven and earth. Following on from Anaximander, Parmenides' statement that, quote, nothing comes from nothing, quote, seems to take the concept of the boundless one step further and begs the question of an unmoved mover. We might then see Parmenides' notion of the perfect sphere as a geometrical stand-in for the perfect being, the God of monotheism. Furthermore, Parmenides' metaphysical logic, the notion that something can make sense without needing to be proven, that purely abstract arguments transcend earthbound naturalistic arguments by granting access to a higher plane of consciousness, prefigures Christian apologetics. Quote, it must be that what can be spoken and thought is, for it is there for being, and there is no such thing as nothing, says Parmenides, as the sparks fly upward. With Empedocles, the reconciliation between love and strife within the sphere of being gives movement to the world. Love has a tendency to unify things, whereas strife causes things to fall apart. As Empedocles puts it, quote, but under love we unite into a single ordered whole, which under strife once again becomes, instead of one, many. End quote. In Empedocles, therefore, we see a precursor to the Christian eschatology of the battle between good and evil, heaven and hell, as the engine of history. Finally, it may be too obvious to point out that Heraclitus's explanation of the Logos as something which inhabits the whole world, is intelligent and alive, and which itself makes the world intelligible to mankind, even as it speaks through them, will find its echoes in the lines of John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Conclusion. From aqua vita to the breath of life. Ultimately, what the early Greek thinkers point to is the search for a first cause. We see a progression from the concrete to the abstract. Thales believed that everything was made of water, Anaximenes that everything was made out of air, Heraclitus that fire underpinned all, and Empedocles that love conquered all. Indeed, in his Metaphysics, Aristotle criticizes the early Greek thinkers for their account of movement without a first cause of this first movement. With Aristotle's answer to this conundrum, the unmoved mover, we see a Christian teleology reaching back from the early Greek thinkers through Aristotle onto St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. The end.
Fantastic. Thank you, James.
Cheers.
Dare I say this was the best one I've heard from you so far.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you very much. Really good. If there are any questions, feel free to ask one now. If not, then maybe just because I think Jack's talk might be quite a good fit after this one. Jack, are you ready?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect.
Yeah, let me go ahead. Actually, this is a work in progress. I of course, completely overwrote this, and I had to then change and narrow down my topic. So my working title is Heraclitus, Exploration of Cosmos and Logos. And I put aside all the elements and flux and things. So introduction. Cosmos meant order before it meant world. And this fact of etymology gives insight into the project of the early Greek philosophers to make their world and their place in it intelligible. Even though they were surrounded by their vividly experienced Mediterranean world with all its beauty and strife, they chose a word that did not refer to the physical material aspect of the world, nor to the world of human affairs. Rather, they chose a word that referred to what they believed their world, seen in its entirety and unity, manifested, and that is order. The origins of the word cosmos include notions of ordering, arranging, arraying, and structuring discrete parts into a coherent whole, one that functions as a unity and that is greater than the sum of its parts. Also, as Pierre Vernon writes, quote, in place of the old cosmogonies associated with royal rituals and myths of sovereignty, new thoughts sought to base the order of the world on relations of symmetry, equilibrium, and equality among the various elements that made up the cosmos. Thus, this new thought sought to give an account of the world that did not rely on the capricious activities of the gods of the pantheon, nor on heroic myths. The focus of this essay is on the related concepts of cosmos and logos in Heraclitus, as articulated in the 124 fragments of his thought that remain available to us. According to one scholar of Heraclitus, Daniel Graham, it was Heraclitus that first used the word extant that's available to us, used the word cosmos to refer to world. So, cosmos. In his most direct statement, Heraclitus writes, quote, the cosmos, the same for all things, comma, no one of gods or men has made, but it always was and is and ever shall be, an ever-living fire, kindling according to fixed measure and extinguishing according to fixed measure. From this, we learn many things about his view of cosmos. One, cosmos is ordered, as surely by definition it must be, but within this order there is flux. Here, Heraclitus equates cosmos with an ever-living fire and captures the order within which flux is contained by stating that it kindles according to fixed measure and extinguishes according to fixed measure. Heraclitus is also well known, of course, for the fragment, and those stepping into rivers, staying the same, other and other waters flow. This fragment also supports the concept of flux within order. At each instance, other waters flow in rivers staying the same. A fragment with enigmatic meaning, one day is equal to every other, may also speak to the order that characterizes the cosmos. And of course, order as an organizing principle can both direct and circumscribe the nature of the flux that occurs. After all, a flux without bounds would lead to chaos, the opposite of cosmos, and then to the dissolution of cosmos. This cannot be, however, for the cosmos is infinite. Number two, cosmos is infinite in time. It always was and is and ever shall be. It remains unclear, however, if the cosmos is also infinite in scope. The phrase about the cosmos being the same for all things may suggest this interpretation. Three, cosmos is divine. Because the Greeks of this period equated infinity with divinity, the cosmos was itself seen as divine, a divinity that did not rely on its genesis, nor one can infer on its maintenance on the gods. The presumption was that the cosmos encompassed the natural world in which humans lived, the supralunar celestial world, and the world of the gods, who, although divine and transcending embodied existence, took on human form and lived on Mount Olympus. Thus, the gods, themselves divine, were but a part of this ordered divine world. And four, cosmos is a unity. Heraclitus writes, "It is wise to hearken not to me, but to Logos, and to confess that all things are one." As such, we humans do not construct the cosmos each to our own conceptualization. Rather, we learn to recognize the internal unity and order. The thinkers who did develop competing accounts of the cosmos, wrong-headed ones according to Heraclitus, did so because they did not use the right approach. We come to understand the true nature of the cosmos through a method of inquiry that Heraclitus championed, by focusing on the unity and order that underlies the multitude of elements, transformations, and the continual flux. Many men do not have the wisdom because they do not perceive order and unity. Heraclitus is biting in his criticism, stating, quote, "Much learning does not teach one to have understanding, else it would have taught Hesiod and Pythagoras, and again, Xenophanes and Hecataios." He adds, they that are awake have one world in common, but of the sleeping, each turns aside into a world of his own. This focus on order and on the method of recognizing it within the ongoing flux brings us to the concept of logos. Logos. What is logos? Or to ask it differently, to what does the word logos refer? The answer is not readily apparent. Most thinkers that reflect on the use of the word logos in Heraclitus agree that it refers to an aspect of the cosmos. Logos is, quote, the principle of order that the cosmos manifests. But what does principle denote? Is a principle a rule that simply describes the activity of an entity, such as E equals mc squared? As such, a principle is not a force function. That is, it only describes the lawful pattern of activity, but does not prescribe it. It is not the underlying force that drives that activity. Or instead, does logos refer to an underlying truth, which denotes the driving force itself? A reading of Heraclitus leaves the ontological status of logos unclear. However, given his focus on fire as the process of change, recall he equates the cosmos with the everlasting fire, it may be that it is fire that is the driving force of order and flux within the cosmos. So where does that leave logos? Let's consider its etymology. It originates from the verb legein, meaning to pick up or gathered, as used in the time of Homer. It was then extended into the meaning of counting.
Jack,
Yeah?
sorry, 3 minutes.
Yeah, got it. Yeah,
Thank you.
I'll be done. Yes.
Yeah.
It was extended into the meaning of counting, thus referring not to a simple gathering, but to an organizing one that affords the counting and categorizing of what is gathered. The meaning of logos then extended further from counting to accounting, that is, to giving a narrative description of what was gathered, organized, categorized, and counted. And notice the relationship to the word accounting to counting. Note also that the English word tell initially meant to count before it shifted to meaning saying something. Thus, logos came to mean the saying of something, but not just of anything. It had to be a truth, an organized description of something that was gathered, reflected upon, and analyzed. With this as background, it becomes clear that logos refers not only to the order that inheres in the cosmos, but also is the account of that order. This account is articulated by humans, of course, but not only the ones that recognize logos. That is the ones like Heraclitus who can look behind the strife and flux and recognize the hidden unity and order. Thus, logos takes on the double meaning of the disclosing of the truth and of what is disclosed, the truth itself. But there must be a third aspect to logos. For the disclosing of a truth must be disclosed to an agent, and that agent must have the capacity to recognize the disclosure and what is being disclosed. So to recognize order and unity, humans must themselves have the mental structuring capacity that instantiates order. In other words, they must have the capacity to reason. And from whence do humans have this capacity? From the universal order that is the cosmos. Thus, human reason is itself a manifestation of and a participation in that cosmic order. And I'll end there. Thank you.
The bar has been set very high by the first two speakers. I'm impressed. Incredible. Okay. Thank you so much, Jack. That was fantastic. Maybe, I think Melanie's might be good because Melanie, I think it's on war in Heraclitus, isn't it? Yeah? I have to, yeah.
It changed a little bit, so
It's fine.
I'll just go ahead.
Yeah.
Into the mystic. The enigmatic early Greek philosopher Heraclitus of Ephesus saw a rhythm to the universe which allows for continuous movement. He said, "Listen not to me, but to the Logos, and follow that which is wise and true, namely that everything is one." Fragment B50. We see the philosophical statement that everything is one repeated throughout the fragments. These fragments that have been passed down through millennium encourage us to engage in the same deep reflection that Heraclitus himself once did. Throughout the fragments, Heraclitus is demonstrating how opposing forces concur simultaneously. Heraclitus delights in hiding his philosophical stance in aphorism and metaphors. Though many consider his writings to be obscure, language is an important feature in his philosophy. As language is full of indeterminable interpretations, we can never have assurance that what the written word means. For Heraclitus, language conceals that which is present, yet unrepresented, and these are given to us through the juxtaposition of double indivisible movements, an example of which can be found in B60, "The road up is also the road down." Heraclitus' philosophical fragments are well thought out and express his passion for language through riddles, paradoxes, while often conjoining opposing forces within the same sentence. Throughout his philosophy, Heraclitus repeatedly shows that it is unity of opposites which form the whole. While opposites retain their ownness, it is the conjunction of the opposing forces that lead to Heraclitean harmony, that everything is one. However, we must bear in mind when reading Heraclitus that men are deceived over the recognition of visible things, fragment B56. Nietzsche, similarly poetic and aphoristic in Vita Feminina, echoes this sentiment when he states that life puts a gold-embroidered veil of lovely potentialities over itself. The question of being, what it is to be, finds its origins in Aristotle's ontology. Being has always given preference to what is present, in the presenting of presence. Aristotle's first written contemplation of Heraclitus pertained to the following: "From this logos that we have here, which always is, Humans show themselves uncomprehending and without understanding, both before they have heard it and after they hear it for the first time, end quote. Aristotle questioned the placement of the word always in this fragment. Heraclitus boldly states in fragment B53 that war of all, Panton, is the father and king of all. War, I will argue, is empirical, objective, and dogmatic reasoning. War represents the metaphysics. It is seen to dominate, and under its rule, all human efforts are directed to one goal, as Gadamer notes. War, like being, always gives preference to what is present. Metaphysics of presence denotes the question of being and the transcendality of the presence of truth. A hierarchical order of thought has granted conceptual privilege to one thing over another. As Heraclitus wittingly states, war of all, Panton, is the father. One opposing force, such as war, which itself separates and divides, is present and seen, while the other force, also present, can go unseen. Here we consider fragment B123, nature likes to hide herself. This is an oversimplification in translation, and Johannes has kindly given us a clearer understanding of this ancient Greek thinking of the same, which says, physicists, that which self-grows, self-rises, self-maintains out of itself and finds a stance, is that which, with pleasure and easiness, retains and upholds herself through keeping herself in another. Here, Heraclitus tells us that nature is always circumnavigating the interior, indeed taking delight in being present but unseen. We may ask if the always that Aristotle questioned is the constant presence of nature herself, who infinitely resides within metaphor, concealed behind the embroidered veil of language. To protect itself, one force becomes violent and clashes with its opposing other. In this convergence, it compromises its own position. War is always understood, making it king of all. If we consider nature as the opposing counterpart of war, it casts doubt on reason, objectivity, and distinctiveness. The restraint with which nature upholds herself through keeping herself in another is that which lies in silence. It may be so well hidden or veiled that it becomes untranslatable, as language can fail in translating the ideal into the empirical. Parmenides of Elae similarly imagined that Sophia, or wisdom, is unveiled in the signs where we only, in quote, advance by retracing our steps. Perhaps our comprehension of Heraclitus would be clearer had he used the word Sophia instead. However, as it stands, nature holds open a space for subjective interpretation within Heraclitus' aphoristic fragments. Closing this circle, Heraclitus' statement, everything is one, represents both the seen and unseen concurring simultaneously, in which fragment B8, out of what is most disharmonious is the most beautiful harmony. And finally, I wish to finish with the words of Samuel Beckett, all of old, nothing else ever failed, ever tried, no matter, try again, fail better. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Melanie. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.
I have to say, I'm very impressed. Which course did you take? This must have been a good one. Seems like you learned something. Anyway, okay. As you can see, you know, I'm getting old. I make bad old people's jokes. So maybe Taylor. We've had a lot of theory now, and now maybe some musicality. Yeah?
Excellent. Yeah, that sounds good.
Good.
All right, so I'm going to share some brief reflections on the drums, inspired by our coursework. I began learning to play the drums as most people do. You start with quarter notes and you move your accent from the 1 to the 2 to the 3 and then to the 4. And then you learn the 8th notes, so you begin moving your accents from the 1 to the 1 and to the 2 to the 2 and so on. This progresses to 16ths and then 32nds. You get triplets in the mix, and suddenly you have a very large toolbox. For every measure, you have at least 32 squared possibilities on how to rest an accent. So, you know, I had thought that this exhaustion of possibility, you know, which is the complete quantification of drumming, I thought that was mastery. Like the, you know, a musical super collider, you could combine all your different drumming particles X number of ways, and there you have it. Over the past decade, though, you know, I've come to find a lot more residing in the space between the notes. And, you know, I've probably, this has probably come at the expense of some technical mastery. The tension, though, that pushes and pulls from one note to the next seems to dominate the note itself. And for me, it's made apparent that which is seemingly absent. Clearly, the absence itself is not a not being. It's implied by the preceding note, and it affords the potential of whatever follows. This absence, this playing with space, you know, it's the essence of what people often describe as playing in the pocket. So the jazz swing is a really common example of what it is to play in this space. So, you know, here, the space between the notes, it's manipulated and shortened, and it's done so to give the whole thing like an anticipatory drive. So I'll show you an example of just a straight feel and a swing, and hopefully the volume will be okay. I'm going to do it rather quietly. But you have your straight feel, so. And then, you know, if you swing it, you get something like. So you understand there's this sort of incredible way to play with time, you know, when you start doing that. You know, even with the uneven spacing, swing, and I think this is true across instruments, it's often notated as straight, and it will just say the words like swing feel written out on top. Or I've seen it when you learn the drums, they'll write it out as a triplet swing pattern, which is to say that center notes are written out a little closer to each other. It's a closer approximation of the reality. But if you were to play this as it's literally written out, it wouldn't be a swing. It would sound robotic, and you could tell right away. So imagine if I painted a picture and I faxed you a scan of it, and then I asked you to paint a replica. It probably wouldn't be difficult, you know, to tell the difference between the two. So as expected, some academics, we'll call them some institutional Pythagoreans, they've tried to spoil the party and calculate a magical swing ratio. So this would be a function of the space between the first notes over the space between the second and the third notes. To my delight, though, these studies have yielded really inconsistent results, ranging from just over 1 to 3.5, which would be like a really fast hard swing. I'll show you an example of like the standard 4/4 beat, which is the staple of contemporary music. And I think it can be really illustrative just because it's a little more familiar to most, you know, of what it means to take something foundational and play with the space. So you have something normal, just like whatever, okay? And now just sit back, and if you get like, you just feel that it's different, and on paper you'd probably write it out, you know, exactly the same. So besides making for some very deep grooves, why is this interesting to me? Well, firstly, in this, you know, bit of space, in this absence, there's an entire musical tradition that exists, and, you know, maybe more deeply, like a mode of being that can't be flattened, it can't be quantified. You know, if an alien encountered some drum notation with the label swing feel at the top, it would be useless. This mode, this music can only ever exist as itself unfolding. Secondly, I think art in general is a way for us to simulate and explore some of the more curious parts of being. And, you know, I've now found through the drums a way to play with absence, that which is normally inaccessible to us. So, you know, in this space where notes are pushed and pulled into some coherent whole, we have a chance to reside where the one and the many might intersect. Thank you.
Incredible. What was it? What did you call them? Academic Pythagoreans?
Yes, the institutional Pythagoreans. There's literature on the swing ratio.
Yeah, you got to trademark that one. That was very good.
Thank you.
Institutional Pythagoreans. There's many of them. They're everywhere. Who might be good next? I don't know. Maybe Dennis. I think Dennis. Okay, go ahead.
Sure. Okay. So first, thank you, Johannes, for taking us back to the early Greeks, and thank all the other participants for the great discussions that we've had over the last few weeks. I didn't feel bound by the abstract that I wrote, but I have written an essay in the same spirit of that abstract. So this is Parmenides and the Arche of Thinking. We must return to the beginning, before the poem begins. Parmenides stands on a low ridge overlooking his home city of Elea, well lit by the overarching Mediterranean sun. The smells and sounds of the city come rolling up the hillside, carried on warm currents of soft air. The young man pauses and turns back toward the horses. After muscling their way up the long slope to this final lookout, they now graze serenely in the meadow close by, unperturbed and ready as always to carry him and his war chariot as far as his heart desires. The maiden guides are already here to meet him, lounging nearby in the dappled shade of their own creation. Looking out over the city below, cherished memories entice him to return along the familiar and well-worn downward path. This journey will surely set him in opposition to his fellow man, who will then push him aside as strange, obscure, and perhaps even dangerous. How dare he ostracize himself from the common good and abandon the people who nurtured him? But Parmenides is stronger than most and responds with courage to the compulsion of justice and right. He turns his back on the city and with fierce resolve leaps into the chariot, crying out, "Show the way, O daughters of the sun." In this decisive moment, the divine maidens immediately throw back their veils and convey him into the light of night and day. The leap is the journey, the resolute act of will that negates the everyday world of practical concerns and carries Parmenides far from the beaten track of men. In the distance, the once bright city of Elea goes dark, shrouded in an opaqueness that now reveals itself as the abode of night. This is the beginning, the negation of all-encompassing everydayness by Parmenides is an original transcendence of thought and marks the historical beginning of the Western philosophical tradition. Along with the other early Greek thinkers, Parmenides forsakes the shared beliefs and values that collectively fix the meaning of being and instead takes up a new and radical philosophical point of view. This is a difficult and bold choice. The everyday human world is never dark. It is always lit by the myriad lights of public understanding that provide and preserve human life against the roiling and destructive nature of the being it inhabits and must therefore hold at bay. Even the goddess teaches the ways of men and speaks of the wondrous truths of the world, the resplendent works of the sun's clear torch, and the wandering deeds of the round-faced moon. For us mere mortals, there is no reason to abandon this fantastic world, and it would be foolish to do so. There is, however, an even more insidious claim or chain that binds us to this human world of everyday truths. In this realm, the question of being is already decided in advance, and we are merely the transparent appropriation of a common way of being in the world. We live gratefully in the fullness of these truths, sheltered and absolved from the difficult task of authentically confronting being for ourselves. Parmenides, on the other hand, makes the courageous choice to question being and transcend the satiated life of man. Looking down from the lofty gates of heaven, he sees the darkness of night descend on those who fail to look beyond the limits of their own truth. Shining forth in the divine light of the goddess, the first entry in the book of philosophy is written in Greek by the steady hand of Parmenides. Esti, it is, an assertion of the full positivity of being as pure and complete actuality. As such, it is the self-evidently true first principle, the first premise, and the initial ground of deduction. But this noble attempt to say being and to grasp the universality of being in a single thought shows itself as an immediate, nascent, and therefore inadequate response to being. This initial existential claim of perfect being plunges Parmenides back into the world of men and the limits of language. He is forced to characterize being in terms of what it is not: uncreated, indestructible, immovable, and without end. Philosophy, it turns out, is a human affair after all. We find ourselves now, as always, at the beginning. The Greek arche to which philosophy must return and which alone can carry it forward is the possibility of the negation of being. It is a hidden and yet ever-present singular choice, and therefore the moral responsibility of thinking itself. Philosophy begins and sustains itself as an audacious act of free will. It is Parmenides who shows us the courage to be truly human and to take the leap that will transcend the fate we have created for ourselves.
Wow. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Excellent. It's incredible. This is, everybody's clapping. You know, we should really clap. We have to, I promise at some point there will be a physical location for all of this. And we can actually drink together properly in the same time zone. It's not so awkward, you know, me sitting here at 6 p.m. and some of you 9 a.m. Oh, I see Nathan there with a beer. Very good. Cheers. So Stella.
Take your mind.
So I'm thinking maybe, Thomas, your story on Thales might be a good fit here. Yep. Okay. How do I do this? Go ahead. I just have to change the speaker.
I have kind of today, we've all noticed that I've kind of been obsessed with the fable of Thales. And then even today in my continual thinking through it, it kind of consolidated in a new form that I just thought was valuable. So that's like what I wanted to share this morning. So I've been like using Thales's fable as kind of like a landscape in which to make sense of Eva de Gennaro. And what I mean by that is precisely the two of the quotes that I keep bringing up. And one of them from Eva de Gennaro being considering philosophy as the knowledge of the way out, and the other one of Heidegger in reference to Thales about how the philosopher must be lowered into the well in order to see the stars by day. So I'm not entirely sure what I'm about to say, like what genre of it is, because it could be philosophy, it could be poetry, it could be phenomenology, it could be something more akin to mysticism. But I'm finding the continual thinking through of it valuable. So that's I kind of want to share that. And even more so, to be more precise, it's since Thales is one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece, maybe this entire 4 weeks or 5 weeks has been a practice of contemplation of the sage, to use one of Pierre Hadot's phrases. So of course we have Thales wandering around, gazing upon the stars. And there's this nature of the well at first when he's gazing upon the stars is withdrawn from his current vision. It's not entirely apparent to him. But then there's the collision with it and then the falling into it. So then the thing that was withdrawn when above is now from within the disclosing toward the way out. So I find that there's this interesting relationship between viewing the well from above as the withdrawing of things, and then viewing the well from within as the disclosing toward freedom. And I find that there's an enacted instant of that within Eva de Gennaro's consideration of philosophy as the knowledge of the way out, because then it's almost like It's an inactive metaphor of precisely what the philosophical tradition is aiming for in terms of its trying to be free, enact freedom, and to go from knowing and having knowledge of the way out to perhaps we could be the kind of people that inhabit and enact freedom. So I find this interesting thing. So this is my playing with Thales. So let's say he could hold the totality of that well structure in his being. So there is the withdrawal of the well, but then when you involve his participation in that, there's also the disclosure. So there's this word in English that I find to be valuable in this instance, which is wellspring. So there's the withdrawing of the well and the springing of the well. So you have this withdrawal and disclosure kind of like, it can be gotten at through this word. And a lot of this is relating back to me trying to make sense of Eva de Gennaro. So let's say Thales could hold this in his being, this structure that is the simultaneity of withdrawal and disclosure. So in this holding of this in his being, perhaps we could move from this, we could make this into like an enacted constant of his being, where it's like in that holding in his being, he could behold in being this kind of free playing of withdrawal and disclosure, and let's say the clearing of being. So I find that this holding of this, it's like we go from the knowledge of the way out to my knowing being as, let's say, the free inhabiting of withdrawal and disclosure in being. So I find this moving from doing philosophy to becoming a philosopher in this kind of sense. Let's see, and there's a few other things from, precisely, this is really what I wanted to say. So then it's like we have this, let's say we have this attunement to being by way of this wellspring. And we can let beings come and we can let beings go as they are. So you can kind of reside in this indifference of things, which I think even Pierre Hadot says, it's like that's the defining quality of the sage, this kind of indifference. And let's see, in the clearing. And then precisely, if we have this attunement to being where it is the free disclosure and the free withdrawal, it's like, I feel like we can get to that point where Eva de Gennaro was saying about Heidegger, how do we not have a return to beings? How do we not ground beings? And it seems in this kind of this attunement to being where it is the free disclosure and the free withdrawal of things, you can actually, let's say, inhabit freedom in a sense. It's like you can actually inhabit a free domain of withdrawal and disclosure. And you don't have to fixating on the rising or the falling, but holding that in your being and beholding and that in the world, I find to be incredibly valuable at the moment. Seeks no obligation to ground. So no longer seeking ways out, but enacting, inhabiting, and dwelling in the free domain of the letting things come and the letting things go. So I find that attunement very interesting, and that's just my current thinking through the thing that I think I'll just continue to be thinking through. And yeah, I'll stop there. But I find that to be valuable, and I just wanted to share that with you all. And grateful for the past 5 weeks.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Very good. And pursue. I mean, all of you should pursue all of this further. And before I forget, because I tend to be forgetful of things, I should say it now. Don't see this as this is not the finish line, even though maybe the course officially ends. But keep in touch, exchange email addresses, whatever, and start a reading group, whatever you wish to do, or keep writing and keep exchanging what it is you're writing on. And I think also this connection between Thales and Plato, or Plato's cave, is really fascinating. So I think maybe we'll just stay with the Thomases. Thomas talking.
I don't. Why not? Why make it very easy? Simplicity is very nice. Repetition.
Yeah.
I have visual slides. Would you? Am I get permission to share my screen?
How can you? Yeah. How do I do this?
You have to give us permission. If you should be by your share screen icon, there should be like an arrow. I teach a lot, so I know about this one on Zoom. If you click that arrow, a permissions window will appear, and you can go in the two options below. You have to allow people to share screens.
Okay, yeah.
All right, cool. And we're good. Great. Okay. All right, cool. Everybody sees my screen?
Yes, sir.
All right, cool. All right, thank you, everybody. All right, so let's resume. Cool. So my talk today is on equal fit, is exploring how typography can be treated for both the individual reader and all readers. So it's a study of secondary and primary substance. The U.S. Department of Education reports that 64% of U.S. students are deficient readers. Attempts have been made to improve reading performance have been made by various government, education, and NGO entities with no change in the statistics for over 60 years. For example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation invested close to $500 million in teacher effectiveness programs with no measurable improvement and canceled the program. A big thing we should take away, not only for this course, but in general, if we're having undesirable outcomes and we keep doing the same thing over and over again and getting the worst outcome, that's a sign to return to the foundation of our understanding. I teach typography to undergrads at the City University of New York City. My primary teaching objective in the typography course is to help students see what they always took for granted. In particular, the idea that typography is embodied language, but the same kind of ignorance that students have in terms of understanding typography in language, we also have in our reasoning. Let me back up and explain. Philosophy since Plato has been concerned with ousia, substance. However, there's been clarifications on that. Primary substance refers to the individual thing, whereas secondary substance refers to a thing's genera and species and differentia. According to Aristotle, a thing's substance is connected to the nature and essence as described from its definition. So this always points to secondary substance. So when we take this account, what is the nature of reading then? Educators use the simple view of reading model to focus on teaching instruction. The model describes three elements: decoding, language, and comprehension. When the marks of writing are successfully decoded and processed into the sounds of a known language, comprehension is achieved. Comprehension means both the explicit knowledge of a statement and the ability to infer meaning that's not explicitly stated. So when we say that students are not reading proficient, they are not able to understand the meaning of a statement, and make inferences from that statement. Or writing, better said, excuse me. So if proficient reading occurs where there's a fluent comprehension in the reader, reading well is analogous to reasoning well. Therefore, reading is associated with the nature of a person, an individual substance of a rational nature. However, we have a difficulty. This activity we call reading occurs not in some abstraction called reader, but in this reader or that reader, in the act of reading itself. Secondary substances may reach us to the nature of reading, whereas the reading of this transcript to you is piercing to my individual substance in this exact moment. This difficulty is an issue in our instruments of reasoning. Let me make my case to build on our problem here. Here's an example of an average font that bears an archetype form. In general, such patterns are considered evidence that particular typographic variations are accidental to the nature of letters. But reality behaves very differently in other contexts. For example, the US military attempted to design the perfect cockpit for fighter jet pilots. The engineers went in and measured the physical dimensions such as arms, legs, waist, neck length, and so on. These measurements were averaged to create the perfect cockpit. Perfect, except that the primary individual substance is not secondary substance. Once the cockpit was designed, it was discovered the engineers had built a Procrustean bed. No single actual pilot actually fitted in this cockpit. Some pilots had legs that were too long, or arms that were too short, or neck too long, and so on. So this perfect cockpit derived from an average did not work out. It didn't play out so as expected. If we see an error in an average universal cockpit for individual bodies, how could we be so confident that the same universal average typography would hold true for individual intellects? Aristotle acknowledges this distinction of a good in itself and goods in the person when he retorts the idea of goodness, as proposed by Plato. A doctor seems to not even study health this way, but the health of a man, or perhaps rather the health of a particular man. It is individuals that he is healing. And the defect, Aristotle continues and points out that any master of any art avoids excess and deficiency, but rather seeks the intermediate, but not in the object, but relative to the person. I love this story he talks about in the Ethics. For example, if 10 pounds of food is too much for a particular person to eat and 2 pounds are too little, it does not follow that the trainer will order 6 pounds, an average, divided up. 6 pounds may be too little caloric intake for an experienced athlete with high caloric intake demands, but it might be too much for a beginner. So if we take Aristotle's account seriously, then typography finds the intermediate not in the marks being averaged out to some average font that works for everybody, but rather to the individual reader themselves. What would this individuated typography look like? Let me pause for a moment and recall a breakout room discussion on Parmenides. Together, the group attempted to bridge Parmenides' claim that there is no non-being. Slowly, examples from music and typography came to the surface. Taylor's great demo with drums is just one example of that. Both disciplines share a distinction between a novice and experienced practitioner. The novice begins with their attention on the marks on the page, whereas the experience gives their attention to the absences between the marks. The absences between the marks are indeed real, like an ocean of absences marked by ships of presence. The connection between typography and music is not an accident.
Thomas,
while the substrate is different.
Thomas, 3 minutes, sorry.
Thank you. While the substrate is different, the temporal structure between presence and absence holds for both music and typography. If reading is analogous to reasoning, as both occur over a time duration and reading occurs over a time sequence of marks and absences between those marks, then a model to consider individuated typography would synchronize the marks and absences that comprise typography to the individual reader. Okay, that's a big mouthful. And talking in abstractions is never as clear as a particular demonstration, so let me end this talk with such a demonstration. Meet Emily. Emily is a second grader who struggles to read. I met her father through a cold pitch for public relations services, but our conversation moved to a recent project I worked on called Lexend. Lexend is a variable font designed to improve reading activity in students by amplification of spacing between and inside letters. Lexend is available on Google Fonts and is therefore free and accessible to use anywhere in the world. I sensed speaking to David, Emily's father, on the struggles and anxiety of his daughter's difficulty in reading, and after a few minutes of listening and asking some diagnostic questions, I suggested to David to set a page of text in Lexend Tetra setting and another page of text set in a traditional setting, something like Times New Roman. As a practitioner, even I was surprised by what David messaged me a couple of weeks later. With the text set in Times New Roman, Emily had 22 words missed, read over 128 seconds. Another set of text set in Lexend Tetra, she only missed 1 word and read over 105 seconds. This is an improvement of 18% faster reading with 95.5% more accuracy. Her father left me a glowing message of appreciation over the holidays, thanking me for teaching him the importance of typography, and shared how his daughter's teacher cried when she saw the improvement, which occurred instantaneously by this amplification of spacing. We understand that some people are nearsighted And such persons need objects to see objects from a distance and require glasses compared to normal sighted people. We would never think to give the same prescription glasses to everybody. Some people need a stronger prescription, some need weaker, and some need no prescription. And thus, therefore, we see, if we understand that analogy, we also understand that giving everybody the same font is actually a hindrance. It's unreasonable. It's nonsense. And as I emphasize in this talk, this gap in understanding between primary and secondary substance is a fundamental flaw in our reasoning, which has resulted in millions of children never learning to read properly, which affects their lives going forward, with untold complications in their lives. I'm out of time, but I'm going to close by saying, ideally, by gathering this new understanding of both the individual reader and the nature of reading together, we have the potential to improve the reading lives of children all around the world, and perhaps extrapolating out to the potentials of stronger reasoning in our social, political, and moral lives. Thank you so much, everybody's time. You can follow me on Twitter if you like to. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Thomas. Cool. Thank you. Very good. Very different. And also good to see. I mean, this is something that came out of, I think, one of the early discussions, right, that we had. Great. Maybe Molly. Do you want to go ahead? Yeah? You're still muted.
I'm unmuted now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So today I'm just really interested in sort of the transition between myth and philosophy, and particularly as philosophers, the sort of the question of questioning itself, sort of like these foundational epistemological questions. And basically in relation to both these, I'm pretty much going to argue that the gods haven't gone away, that there's still a certain sense of theos in philosophy. So to begin, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Hegel's dialectics, and basically, as Philip was explaining earlier in the seminars, about how there's sort of we come to an understanding, and then this understanding sort of sublates itself or disintegrates. And then there's a sort of speculative move where the understanding and its disintegration are kind of not quite integrated, but sort of synthesized in a certain degree. So then we have a new understanding. And there's this kind of recursive process, almost like a process of growth, whereby like previous understandings kind of shed themselves and like move forward, like a snake shedding its skin. And just like just the main observation about that is there's still this relationship to origin, because with each understanding it necessarily sublates itself. So there's this kind of train going forward and going back. Now the question I have about this, and not so specifically about how Hegel answers it, but just more generally, is this process of growth infinite or is it finite? Because it seems that we run into difficulties if we take either horn. So say, for example, you say, okay, it's finite. We reach like an understanding, and that's like, there's one understanding that doesn't sublate itself, and that's the understanding that we want. And that's it. The problem with this is it seems to mean that the process of inquiry ends. And at that point, the inquiry stops and we're demotivated and we no longer have a drive or desire to inquire. So that doesn't seem right, because it doesn't seem true. But also it's like, we don't really seem to want to have inquiry to have a stopping place. But on the other hand, if we said that it was infinite, we still run into basically the same difficulty, because usually when we want to understand something, we want to kind of hold on to it, to grasp it in a certain way. We want to reach something. And to say that the understanding constantly sublates itself, we're never really reaching anything. And I think this could definitely demotivate your inquiry. So basically, this is kind of also related, I guess, to, sorry, one second, just let me get my notes. To kind of like a skeptical versus a realist picture of the world, and how both sort of run into difficulties. Because if you sort of have, and like comparably, sort of like if you have a sort of realist picture that's like maybe foundationalist, for instance, then you sort of have a ground for your understanding, but where does that ground come from? And if you have like a skeptical one, you're saying like, okay, maybe we don't have a ground, but then that also seems to demotivate the inquiry. So we seem to have a problem with both ends. And what I'm trying to point out here as well is that there seems to be a train, sorry, I just got your comment there, thanks, John. But there seems to be a train of infinities going both forward and back. So like, if we, in terms of the process of inquiry itself, that like there's problems with infinities there, because it's like either it's finite or it's infinite. We've run into difficulties with both. And then in terms of the ground, in terms of where we begin, we also have problems with infinities, because it's like, do we begin here? Okay, why there? Or why not somewhere else? Or is it infinities all the way down? We have difficulties. So there seems to be all sorts of difficulties within epistemology, and this kind of maybe slightly crude as philosophical way of dealing with it. But anyway, the reason I wanted to bring this up and to talk about these kind of problems was, I think that these kind of problems, even though they're problems within philosophy, within logos, are comparable to the Greek sense of theos, that theos itself is self-disguising. And what I mean by that is, like, we can know specific things, we can experience knowledge, but maybe when we turn to question knowledge in a certain way, when we can't begin to question our questioning itself in a certain way, we run into difficulties. And I think what we can take from the theos is maybe, rather than this demotivating our inquiry, maybe this very sense of mystery actually sets our inquiry aflame, and is something that, you know, is extremely invigorating. So I just want to give two examples of sort of thinkers that I think maybe, and also just to point out, in a way, this isn't surprising if we take the Hegelian dialectic, because as we saw before, the origin, in a sense, never goes away because it contains its disintegration. So in a way, it's not surprising that we find ourselves back at theos. But anyway, the two examples, first one I wanted to give was Nietzsche's kind of active nihilist, and we could sort of take that as sort of stance which faces epistemology with vitalism and with an active attitude which is affirmative, and sort of takes a sense of wonder and uses it to, and this sense of unknowability, and uses it to actually invigorate the inquiry. The second example I wanted to give was the Pyrrhonic skeptics, who are also from ancient Greece but come a bit later, and they basically have this move of aporia followed by apoke. And just in this brief talk I give, when I talked about the infinities, like, or whether the knowledge quest is infinite or finite, that could have brought about in some of you a sense of aporia, where you're kind of basically, you're stuck in a dilemma, and you sort of don't know where you stand. You're sort of confused. Your original assumptions are like sort of sort of become a bit unstable. And then followed by this, they basically move on to apoke, which is kind of like a suspension of judgment. So it's kind of like a halting, but it's also a halting which allows for further questioning, which is the sort of, it's a kind of lived or practical philosophy, whereby as far as I understand it, there's this kind of pause, and it's kind of like it actually allows for life to go on. So that's really all I wanted to talk about today. And pretty much just argue that when we're faced with these kind of difficulties, just kind of simple difficulties that you can get when you start thinking about epistemology a little bit, maybe we can take the message of theos, that basically, like, when faced with infinity, maybe actually, and faced with our own finitude and faced with our knowledge's finitude, and that contrast between infinity and finitude is actually, rather than that bringing about a sort of despair or a sort of passive nihilism, can actually bring about a very invigorating, active form of nihilism. And we can sort of understand that as similar to the interaction with the divine, where the gods don't appear as themselves; they necessarily take on a material form, and this is wonderful and interesting. So yeah, so that's all I wanted to talk about today. Thanks.
Thanks very much. That'd be great. Thank you. You have to write this almost like a second volume to Pierre Hadot's Philosophy as a Way of Life. Seems to be you're branching out into your own one here. Very good. Maybe Nathan, maybe we'll bring it back to war again. Is it war? I think it was war. Well,
There's yeah, sure. I'll just get into it. So yeah, so I'm talking about Heraclitus on thought and on the nature, the splitting, dividing, striving nature of thought. I'd like to begin with a poem, or part of a poem by someone called Yanai. The story goes about Yanai, who lived in late antiquity, that he did two things. One was that he wrote the most important prayer or poem in Jewish liturgy, Unetana Tokef, which is recited on Yom Kippur, if I've got that right. And the other is that he was so jealous of his protege, Kalir, Ben Kalir, that he killed him. In any case, he was almost forgotten. His name was almost forgotten for many hundreds of years. But this particular poem was rediscovered, I think, in the 19th or in the 20th century, and part of it was damaged, but you get the idea. It's called The Celestial Fire. Now, all these poems are based on like expounding on a particular biblical verse. In this case, the verse is, "Now an angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a blazing fire, a fire that devours fire, a fire that burns in things dry and moist, a fire that glows amid snow and ice, a fire like a crouching lion, a fire revealing itself in many forms, a fire that is, never dies, a fire that shines and roars, that blazes and sparkles, a fire that flies in the storm wind, a fire that burns without wood, a fire that renews itself every day, a fire that is not fanned by fire, a fire that billows like the branches of palms, a fire whose sparks are flashes of lightning, a fire black as a raven, a fire curled like the colours of the rainbow." And what is this fire, black as a raven, yet curled in its many colours, that burns in things dry and moist? It devours its own kind. What is that one whose revelation is in many? This was what confronted Heraclitus. And my proposal is that the fire of which he speaks, the fire that the world ever was, is thought. That thought is fire, and that the phusis of which Heraclitus speaks, the nature, phusis that loves to hide itself, is the phusis of thought. And by knowledge of this phusis, we come to know ta'onta, what is. And what makes Heraclitus a dangerous thinker is that this turns out to be what is not, to be the nothing. When we take fire as a principle, we put first something that is never itself, that is never the same. A modern way of thinking about it, fire is a process. One thing turns into another, but that misses something. The modern way is to see a sequence. First you have fuel and oxygen, then a reaction, and then ashes. Is that Heraclitean fire? I don't think so. Heraclitean fire is fire that is and never expires, as Yanai puts it. It has a nature, has a phusis for Heraclitus. It is self-rising, self-maintaining, a fire that renews itself every day. And that phusis is to be dissimilar from itself. And for Heraclitus, fire is never a thing. It's never even to itself what it is. And that is how it maintains itself. That is itself maintaining. Now, thought, logos, which says Heraclitus is common to all, shares in this phusis. Thought which never changes and never comes into conflict, into strife with itself, is dead. Hence you have Heraclitus on Homer, who didn't see in praying for the perishing of strife among gods and men, that he was praying for the destruction of the world. That starts to get to the harshness of Heraclitus, the brutality, you might almost say. Unlike Parmenides, who warns us against thinking what is not, for Heraclitus, thought is already that which is not. Thought is already beyond the limit of ta'onta, the what is. But how can that be? Like this. The nothing, the outside, is already inside. It's already our ownmost being. As the outside comes in, thought splits, thought becomes divided from itself, it shatters. The oneness of thought is multiplicity. And the will to think is the will to permit thought. That means the will to become manifold. To convey my fascination with Heraclitus' words, I'll turn last to another poet, Shakespeare. This is from Macbeth, who's having second thoughts about killing King Duncan, and Lady Macbeth will have none of it. Macbeth says, "Prithee, peace, I dare do all that may become a man. Who dares do more is none," says Lady Macbeth. "What beast was't then that make you break this enterprise to me? When you durst do it, then you were a man, and to be more than what you were, you would be so much more the man." It's the genius of Shakespeare that a demonic exhortation to commit murder, regicide, to abrogate the moral order can be so inspiring. Actually, when I was learning Hebrew about 10 years ago, I wrote those last 4 lines, "When you durst do it," at the top of my notebook. And it works because I know Hebrew. To be so much more the man, to dare more than may become a man, to be in the end no man, that's our nature. In the end, that's what we are. To be more than ourselves, and thereby to become other than what we are. Heraclitus spoke well, I think, that the gods and men each live the other's death and die the other's life.
Thank you. Very good. Because this is something that I want to comment too much, because but this is something I'm also interested in, this connection between the what we would now call Hebraic thought, perhaps, and the Greek. Very good. Okay, let me. Thank you. Remove pen. Javier, your poem might be its moment to be born and to die as well at the same time. Let me pin you briefly. Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So hopefully I can give this poem the eloquence it deserves. This is probably the first time I wrote like a really long poem. So here it goes. The poem is titled "The Son of Heraclitus." Part 1, the morning. Oh, horrific beauty, to die and to live, to slay and to be slain, to be tortured and to be saved. Men lay asleep, unaware of their walking paralysis. Birth from fire, I experienced my greatest joy and the most unwelcoming burden. The death of my father. Is this punishment to steal the wine of the gods? To taste a drop of godlikeness and then to fall and bear the taste of my godlike suffering? We are convinced of our robbery. Oh, the guilt. Yet the cabinet was left unattended, unsecured, unguarded. Who is the real thief? God or man? We had faith in God while God had faith in us. In this, we felt a great betrayal of one another. Yet in our hatred, love spurts like a fountain. I have wet my soul for you, so I may feel your primordial warmth. Reveal yourself. I wish to know what my father spoke of. A primordial fire appears. I cannot bear you, says the son of Heraclitus. Primordial fire. You demand me, yet you cannot bear? Have you forgotten joy itself and the ever sweetness of knowing? Let me change form to something of your bearing. Heraclitus appears. My father, yes and no. I am your father and not your father. Explain to me then. A secret is a garden that must be well kept. To leave it to the crows would be disastrous. Where is your childlike wonder, my dear son of Heraclitus? The boy who danced for the sake of dancing. This is what disputational knowledge does to you. Tell me your own story. There is no danger in reading about men who have lived their own. You have yet to shed such blood. You are but an echo of giants. Leave this foolishness behind. The primordial fire dissipates. Part 2, Journey of the Soul. Ever since those haunting words, I awoke and became a slave to the sea. I sailed in silence and in suffering. Is it not true that when one cries, it kisses the earth, only for it to kiss you again from the sky? I'm crying for God, and God comes crying after me. There are devilish women in these murky waters, and occasionally they wave seductively to me, urging me to join them. They claim to know the secrets I yearn for, yet I know well I am but a crow still weaning in the egg of darkness. In this void I see nothing, yet I am kept warm by a mysterious presence, either by a foul creature that has consumed me, or by a God who sits upon me. Am I his seated throne? Do I incubate his power, while he incubates my being? Is it not strange that everything is oddly romantic, oddly and absurdly one? Does man not stare at the night sky anymore? Darkness and light brushed in one single sweep of my eye, to then fall out from an empty sun, yet burst from the ocean, kissing the moon. You remain empty for fullness, and then fullness comes and empties itself for you. I know now that I am a lover who's forgotten how to speak, so I take the oar and stir the sea, rippling the moon as it ripples my soul. I become the ink and I learn to speak. I am a walking love song in the middle of a battlefield, where every death is a new note, a war cry piercing through the field between death and freedom, a string plucked by delicate fingers, created to die in order to kiss God's ears. And in this I give him life, so he continues to give me my own. I am the muse of a mysterious loneliness, where one cannot do without the other. We are like one single soul talking out loud, just to feel the company of one's voice. In this way I fall asleep and dream. Part 3, the dream. We are lovers arguing on the bridge of the cosmos. We hurl burning stars at each other, yet I see what it means now. You are sad, God, yearning to know what it means to be limited, and I myself, a sad, mortal, pathetic man, yearning to know what it means to be limitless. We are each other's smoke and fire, and in this we make love. You teach me how to become immortal, and I teach you how to die. We tear a piece of our flesh and feed it to each other, only to discover it is of the same. In this moment, we no longer feel separation. We meet in union like dawn and dusk, where neither can discern the death and birth of day and night. We cannot help but feel our overwhelming wholeness, for in those divine cosmic eyes I see myself, and in my own you see yourself. The water reflects the violet sky, while showing the fish beneath my face. Tell me something beautiful again, so I can come and whisper it back to you. And there God hatches, awaking from his slumber, playing his favorite song, pregnant with wonder and so much man. And that's it.
Wow. Thank you. Very good. Thank you very much. Must have been, I think, one of the finest poems I've heard from you so far. So, thank you. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, after this, you know, who can speak after this? Maybe Axel. Maybe yours is weird enough for this one.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I tell 10 seconds briefly the story? How I think probably it's fair to mention this. I put Axel in touch with Sean Burke, who's a friend of mine, who's a painter. I published his book last year with Halcyon, Winter and Summer, because I felt that they have similar auras. And then Axel wrote a very intense email to Sean and me, something about memories, that everything's built from memories. I thought, if you're looking for a topic, please, I want to hear more. So Axel, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is, I guess, sort of a personal philosophy in my attempt to, my crack at the question of the one and the many, and to kind of preface what I'm going to say, and I wrote down, I'll just show everyone this photo of Marilyn Monroe, which you'll notice if I zoom in is composed of thousands and thousands of little pictures. And so my claim is that in the same way that this larger photo is made from these smaller pictures, that the things of the world are made from memories in a literal sense. So yeah, I mean, I guess maybe it is a form of idealism. So memories as world particles. This about 7 minutes. The word thing comes from the German Ting, which originally meant gathering and concern. It wasn't a word for physical objects, but rather for things as worldly things. That is, things as gatherings that addressed worldly concerns. For example, a sword's address to the world might be, I defend those who wield me. But gatherings of who? Who gathers to make the address which is of concern? And from where does the voice of the gathering come? I claim that memories are that which gathers into things, and that the gathering's voice comes from the stories into which memories are a window. If we hold an artifact of great historical significance, we will feel its historical weight. It will exude a sense of significance and have a depth of meaning that can't be reduced to its physical properties. If we look at it carefully, it won't take long before we find ourselves imagining the story of where it's been and how it came to be. We're sent off into another time, but it's a sending off while drawing in toward the thing. This kind of thing, the historical artifact, says what it says so strongly that its voice calls us clearly into the source of its historical aura, its story. This clarity allows us to see that something very peculiar is happening. Stories from other times have become properties of the artifact. Its historical weight and aura, which are properties of the thing, are made from a weird substantialization process, a worldly substantialization of stories from other times. This worldly substantiation of stories from other times is precisely the way in which things, memories gather into things. The historical aura is this gathering of memory into things. Memories are forgotten stories in remembrance. Their essence lies in being forgotten, but at the same time, being held in remembrance by the voice which carries their understanding. That voice is the what happened of the story, the conclusion, the address. For example, someone might say, let's get together and talk about the good old days. This utterance shows an understanding of the good old days without a full remembering. For a full remembering, they'll have to get together and talk about the good old days. The good old days are forgotten, but held in remembrance by an understanding. This understanding, which we can follow into full remembering, is the memory's voice. The voices of memories hold decorative imaginary immanences, which continuously send us off into stories while simultaneously drawing us into the thing as it gathers. By this sending off while drawing in, the thing shows itself by adorning itself with additional imaginary immanences from the remembered content of the stories from which it's born. The thing shows itself as adornment adorning itself. The voicing of the memories in the addressing of the gathering's concern is the gathering's impetus, which we hear as its name. For example, I protect the voices, I protect those who wield me, and I am unbreakable steel, are gathered into the thing along with other memories with a voicing that we hear as sword. When we call a thing by its name, we are voicing the gathering's concern and the voices of the memories which gather. The voice of the gathering and the voices of the memories are united as one. They are one and many. Memories are the members of the gathering of things, what is always remembered. As such, they are the proper worldly parts from which all things are made. They are worldly parts because they play a part. They have a voice in the gathering. They are also finite parts because they refer to stories within a particular time and horizon of being. Therefore, memories are essentially the finite worldly particles that constitute all things. But they are also the bridge between stories and therefore times. In the constitution of finite things, they provide historical continuity through remembrance. In a sense, they form a historical field from which the particular emerges. So they're kind of, particle and wave at the same time. When we feel a thing's historical aura, we're feeling the edge of the unfolding of history and manifestation, the edge of history manifestation. The story of memories is the story of the gathering of things, the bridge across times, and the unfolding of history. But it's also the story of the one and the many as the story of stories.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Incredible. I want to read that novel or that book or whatever, or want to watch that film or whatever you're going to do with this one. Very good. Maybe Tonatius. Maybe we need more war again. Go ahead.
Thank you. Not as sophisticated as previous what we've seen before, but it does touch a bit on memory, so I guess it's an appropriate continuation. Yeah. Okay, so just my thoughts on the problem of loss of appearances. We saw through the course the attempt of these early thinkers to find the origin or head of all things, or to see the common harmony in all that it is, and not just a collection of isolated particulars. The leitmotif in our course has been one and many. The many is already obtained by using our senses, or common sense, imagination, and memory, with the one still remaining absent. A bit more on that later. Thales begins with the idea that all is water as first attempt to articulate a commonality in all things, a common origin, since he observes moisture or lack of it as a common trait. Anaximander would expand on this notion and affirm that the origin is the apeiron, something boundless that separates through some injustice, incoherence, or error. With this, we start to see a more abstract view of the arche, not constrained by the material limitations that the appearances have. Since apeiron has no bound, it cannot have a definite visible structure. However, it still has a material quality, since it can be divided in everything else that has mass, a shape, and therefore still exists in the world of appearances. With Parmenides and Heraclitus, we have a radical departure where the origin is pure speculative thinking, not even an undefined matter. For Parmenides, we have a united being with thinking, leaving no room for non-being. Here there is a complete harmony separated from what can be seen, leaving us with a pure abstraction, so the sensible world is relegated to the view of mortals. This creates a new problem, where the world can be simply discarded, not explicitly stated by Parmenides, but followed to its extreme conclusion by Zeno, who thinks scenarios that make movement impossible. Achilles never catches up with the tortoise, and the arrow never really leaves its starting point. This, however, might not necessarily hold for Parmenides, since he still needs to draw upon certain images in order to get to his idea. As a poet, he thinks of she is taken to the heavens by a goddess who might be Truth, Aletheia, and meets Justice or Dike, sees the gate of day and night, but also this unity cannot have empty space nor difference of distance in any point, and is giving the shape of a sphere. So there's still a possible shape that he can see, even if it's not in a literal sense. Even if the attempt is to deny the separate from, it's to separate the visible, we do not have pure thinking that escapes the capacity to have appearances. So even if the world is completely illusory, the image is still part of his thinking and therefore being. So there is still hope for the world to exist, even if on his thinking remains unavailable. We get a different case if we take a more literal approach of John Burnett, where we have a literal material sphere. Here the appearance is maintained, but it becomes impossible to see the world in this instance. I really cannot understand in this case why Parmenides would think the sphere to separate from the image and therefore the sensible world, and then get a stranger and even less helpful image. Heraclitus allows for difference where Parmenides is more rigid. There is acknowledgement that what contains there is not. He gives example, giving birth contains death, salt water can be both vital and lethal, and medical practice is both the noble art of healing and bringing wellness to the patient, and also a collection of gross actions such as stabbing, burning, and poisoning. If you've ever seen someone who survived a cancer treatment, you know this all too well. Thinking this state of becoming risks not explicitly refuse the appearances like you could with Parmenides, but to distrust them to the extreme where the flow and gathering of opposites and constant becomings means that everything in the world is unreliable. The image, even if it exists, cannot tell you what it is, and nothing really makes sense. Not one nor many, and you become cratylus, unable to speak and move. However, there is a reliable order in Heraclitus, where the flow of the river is not a chaotic, unfathomable state of change, but the flow itself can tell you what the river is. Here, the appearances, even though insufficient, can help as a starting point, and then can be gathered together in order, like fire exists arising, consuming itself, giving light, shadow, but still existing. If we can gather together the thinking being we got from Parmenides with the world image, we can have a good order, the cosmos. One question then is pertinent to us after all this is why thinking gets separated from appearances in the first place, if it risks losing any connection to the world. The image, as I stated at the beginning, are collected from the senses, imagination, and memory. You receive many, but never the one. That is to say, collections of individuals, but not the order between all of them. So to try to get the arche through the image becomes not just fruitless, but maddening. In taking this approach to the extreme, we would become like the character Irineo Funes from Jorge Luis Borges' short story Funes de Memorios, a young gaucho that after an accident can remember absolutely everything he has ever seen to the last detail, not only overwhelmed, paralyzed, and unable to sleep by the saturation of data, but then affirms that the numerical system, where we can name numbers by positionality, unit, tens, hundreds, is incomprehensible to him, and suggests an easier method where every number in existence has its own particular name. So the number 7013 is called Maximo Perez. The number 7014 is called the railway. Then comes Napoleon, then sulfur ad infinitum, and becomes impossible for him to understand the common language, since he saw a dog on the side at 314 and then in the front at 315. He would have to refer to two completely different things. The perfect memory makes it impossible to think, since thinking requires to forget, extract generalities, erase details, and obtain abstractions. We saw that the Greek word for truth is aletheia, where lethe is the river of forgetting, and dia is a negation. So to uncover the truth, the forgetting would be a necessary step. To lose the image in the process to get the full generality, the one, and then think true to it and recover it. Lose the image through thinking, per thinking with being, and per again the thinking being with the image. Lose the world to gain the cosmos, and escape the fate of both Funes and Crathylos, and definitely avoid running forever like an idiot after a tortoise without catching up.
You done? Yeah. One point of contention. This was as you. What did you say? It's not very sophisticated. I would say it was very sophisticated. An incredible summary of all that we have been discussing over the past month. But more than that, also a very good question was asked. And I'll just very briefly say something. I know I promised to shut up, but why does thinking get separated from the appearances? This is the problem of German idealism. When Fichte talks about intellektuelle Anschauung, intellectual intuition, this is exactly what he's after. And Hölderlin as well, and then Hegel will give up on it and Schelling. Thank you very much. So maybe Stee, you could go next on music. Where's Stee? Linda Pedersen. Stee, are you ready?
Yes.
Good. Okay, go ahead.
This is just it's just a bit of mood music, really, on this book that I've just read about music in ancient Greece. So I just was going to give you a few of my reflections and thoughts on it, really.
Sorry, maybe show the book again because I hadn't pinned you yet.
This is just been released this month by Spencer Clark, and it's called Music in Ancient Greece. And so it's just, I thought I'd read it and just share with you a bit of what would have been the sounds people playing in these periods. But just before that, you know, we encounter similar problems that we encounter when we are trying to read, you know, these ancient Greek texts, as when we're trying to decipher the music, some of which Taylor sort of touched on earlier, and also Ivo de Gennaro in his talk talked about this these problems of historical translations and bring them into the future. But yeah, so broadly, some of the themes in this book, it's a very accessible book if anybody's interested in it. He touches on the whole sort of gamut of musical life, from where it was played, what it was played on, some of the theoretical technicalities, some of the political aspects, and a sort of all-round cultural insight into it. And at the end of each chapter, he gives a description of where you could go for further reading. So it's quite broad, but a good way just to get a sense of what it is. So maybe a good place to tell you about is some of the instruments. There's the kitaro, which is it's a guitar basically. There are I don't think there are any surviving guitars, kitara, but it's depicted a lot on vases and things like that. And there are lyres and harps. But yeah, the kitara is very prominent. And you also have something called aulos, or auloi, the plural, which are pipes. Look, you put two in your mouth like that at the same time, and you play them like that. And one of them was slightly lower. I won't attempt to play my pencils. So, you know, this they maybe thought that this was maybe more of a bass drone sound, and this one was maybe more of a melodic sound. Using circular breathing, you know, you could keep the tone going. So those were very prominent, and those two were used in tandem a lot, along with choral music and tambourines and some percussion as well. So those were the type of sounds you would have come across. I think to the point that I think Aristotle wrote something to the equivalent, "Oh, the bloody auloi, I can't stand the constant drone of the auloi." I mean, but obviously he was coming from more of a noble perspective than you know, the people playing them, and the alloy were maybe more of a more for celebrations and things like that, and town square type of feel to it. Yeah, so he likened the musical scene in Athens and Sparta to something like the melting pot in Detroit in the jazz era, which is quite a nice image, I thought, or New York, where between Athens and Sparta and the Near East, there was a lot of commerce of musical ideas and people bringing all of it together and sharing their techniques and ideas and things like that. So that would have been a very exciting time. That was from about 500 classical Greeks, basically 500 BC, and moving forward from then. So it talked about that a little bit. There was some attempts to sort of theorize and systematize the music. They were written by Aristophanes, and we have some understanding of what the scales would have been like from him. He's written down some systems. Pythagoras as well talked about the harmony and the way the notes should be arranged. But I think most of it is coming from things like the positions of the holes on the alloy, because you can analyze these very closely and work out what the pitches are. And so you get a sense of what the scales they would have been using. And that sort of leads you to what sort of melodies would have been appearing as well. And you can also analyze like where the frets were on these depictions to see what they were coming up with. But just to give you a rough idea, what they think they were tetrachords. So there were fixed positions within the scales. And then, so a tetrachord is a set of 4 notes, and then which would be like the first 4 of a major scale, and then another set of 4 notes starting from there, which again are another set of the major scales. So from a theoretical point of view, that was what they were working with. And the fixed points are the fourths and the octaves, and the ones in the middle were a bit more free floating, and they could have been basically any notes. So what they think it would have sounded was sort of microtonal potentially, so falling in between the normal chromatic scale that we would think of. So that would have been quite, I don't know what the right word is, but not particularly like diatonic, like beautiful, like classical music. It would have been a bit more sort of dreamy, maybe sounding. I can't think of a great word, but these quarter tones that are involved are going to mean, you know, it's sort of moving around a bit more. What else was I going to touch? A lot of the rhythm, we were understanding about this, and I'm doing it for time, but a lot of rhythm comes from the poetry itself. Most of the poetry we think was probably sung, and I think it's called what is it? It's like hexadilic dactylator. Oh God, I've forgotten that. It's like iambic pentameter, but it's hex. I can't remember what it's called. Sorry, but it bespeaks a very definite rhythm. And so from this knowledge, the knowledge of the notes on here, we can sort of attempt to recreate some of the music, and some of it's there on YouTube. And just in closing, I just wanted to return to what I was saying earlier about the danger of treating all of these things as a sort of standing reserve of code. Because, you know, if we look at the notes that we feel were written and the rhythms that we feel were written, and then try and transplant that into the future, into a kind of mathematical code, as Taylor was alluding to, it misses out an enormous amount. And yeah, you know, for instance, in the fifth, how am I doing for time here?
2 minutes.
Okay. In the 50s, like, you know, people forget like the music of Bach wasn't consistent since Bach. We have everything now as a standing reserve. We assume it's always been there, but when recording came back in the 50s, the first renditions of Bach were extremely sort of saccharine and romantic and overly sort of romanticized, because that's just the way they did it at the time. Then they became a lot more sort of stripped back performances as time's gone on. And so as time's gone on, we've recategorized all of these things, and I wouldn't want to do the same for this ancient Greek music. It's something to be aware of, that when we look into our pool of historical access that we have to every idiom of culture, that we don't become like the T-1000 Terminator, who's able to, like a liquid, assume every kind of shape. And then at the end, when he's dying, you see all the souls that he's sort of assimilated trying to pop out of him, you know, and then he gets all melted. So on that note, on to the next one. Thank you for
Superb. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for bringing this up. Also, the musicality of the Greeks, the musicality of the language, this great rhythm in the way they speak. And also you pointed out that poetry was sung. May I remind you all, you can hear me sing in ancient Greek on the YouTube channel. This is something I did when I was 18 years old. I majored in ancient Greek. That was the Facharbeit. I don't know what the English would be for this, my thesis. So I took a poem by Achillochos and turned it into a musical piece by the metric, the original metric. So thank you, Steve. Oh yeah, Lou. I thought Lou maybe. So how do I do this? I have to pin you. Where's Lou? Oh, Lou, could you also maybe briefly say something on the movie night? Just because some people might want to come, but they don't even know it yet. It's next week, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So, by the way, these talks have been amazing. Thank you all for putting so much effort into it. It's amazing to be part of this. So next Sunday at the same time, we're going to have our movie night, Halkyan. We're going to be watching a documentary called Civilization from 1969. It's absolutely excellent. It actually touches on a lot of things we've been talking about. And the reason we're watching that is because I'm kind of preparing for the German Idealist course that's coming up, but you don't have to be doing the course to get something out of it. This is really fantastic. So if you do want to participate and you've never come to a movie night before, it's very important that you go to the topic. It's in the Philosophia section of the Halkyan forum, and just put your email. Say, I want to come, and put your email. That way you'll be sure to be included when we send an invite. If you've come before, I don't think you really have to, because I probably have your email already. But if I don't have your email, please just post it on the forum there. Should I say anything else? Is that pretty clear? Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. So I didn't realize it would be such a popular topic, Heraclitus, especially the fragment 44 on Polemos, war is the father and king. But I'm going to say a few words about that. I'm really trying to invite you to attempt an experience of Heraclitus's thought. Not sure if we'll succeed, but that's my intention. I would like to say a few words regarding Heraclitus's fragment 44, war is the father and king of all. Indeed, just that first part. The fragment is longer, but just looking at that first thought. To do that, I would like to name two themes that have slowly been coming to the surface in our discussions for the past year, and especially in this course. Those themes are originality and oppositionality. Origins, thinking of opposition and opposites that create opposition. A third theme, the notion of the whole, or the totality, or the oneness of the whole, will be addressed obliquely, but not fully, and it's always going to remain kind of in the background. So we have seen time and time again that the thought of the whole breaks through in early Greek thinking. a lightning bolt, originating perhaps from Zeus, lights up and makes manifest the cosmos in its wholeness. And it was the gift and burden of these Greeks that they had to name this cosmos in order to think it. In naming, we gather up manifoldness and let it presence as gathered under the unity of a single name. For these early Greeks, the speaking that is simultaneous with naming is a speaking of the originality of things. To speak of something is to speak about the origins of that thing. You'll find often in Greek literature all over the place, when somebody introduces themselves, they tell you where they're from and who their father or their family was. To know something is to know its origin. To think the whole cosmos is to ask after the origin of the cosmos. We must try our best to experience the radical, very free, uncoerced originality of this early Greek question. What if the great plurality of phenomena showing forth in the whole of the cosmos traces its roots to one origin? If we bracket for a moment the great history of empirical observation that have supplanted these early Greeks, or perhaps not, and simply contemplate the raw intensity of these early Greek questions, these attempts to name the origin are staggering. Hudor, Thales, Anaximenes, Aperon, Anaximander, Toon, Parmenides, Pur, Heraclitus. But each thinker had also to try and think the unity of the origin simultaneously with the manifoldness of physis, of nature. The sameness of the origin seems most distant from the multiplicity of physis. How can we think this sameness and this multiplicity together? Anaximander's attempt is worth thinking on first. Injustice, amidst the operon's many traits, gives rise to a motion that seeks justice, seeks to right this injustice. The change and growth from the origin that gives way to multiplicity arises from the traits of the cosmos opposing one another through encroachment. But we may ask, was this opposing encroachment present right at the origin itself? In other words, was the origin itself a kind of injustice? Was the origin itself a kind of Anaximanderian injustice, always already underway in redressing opposition? Parmenides penetrated to the depths of this foregoing thought. The origin cannot have been underway to difference from the get-go. Parmenides thinks the unity of the origin with a shocking insight, namely, that the binding unity of the origin has no opposition within it. And yet he still names an opposition, one that cannot be named, actually. Parmenides' radically originary thinking attempts to oppose the unopposable, what is and what is not. And yet he is clear that what is not cannot be thought in a way that what is can be thought. And this almost unsayable opposition is indeed present alongside the origin, but it seems to be constantly at risk of demanifesting into the manifest unity of the origin. And so this is the train of thought I would like us to think on when we try to think about Heraclitus's fragment 44, that war, polemos, is the father and king of all. Heraclitus, in thinking the father and king, is naming the origin of the whole. But to say that the origin itself is a form of war, a form of essential opposition, is a very strange thing indeed. For how can we think the origin out of opposition, and how can we think about opposition from out of the origin, and both of these simultaneously? And I think that German idealism, as Johannes mentioned, is trying to do this, is trying to think about the origin and opposition at the same time. And so that's the dialogue I'm just trying to start here. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. Very good. Getting better and better. All these talks, and you pointed it out, been a year, right? Now, in the Zoom pandemonium. Thank you very much. Okay, we've got two more, right? Am I right? Daniel and Leonard. Am I forgetting anyone? Please don't tell me I'm forgetting anyone. So, I mean, Zahuba, I don't know. You know, with the set, you might go last, perhaps. So maybe Leonard goes first.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll need around 5 minutes, and I mainly need like your poetic traits, I guess. So let us speak in respect of a tune, a manner, a sage, sapiently, and without name. So not so much in the Harry Potter kind of way, even though there might be a kind of parallel in the willingness or unwillingness, the letting or not letting in terms of the whereat or whereof we speak, and of us being fond of naming. So to be named, calling that which we speak about by its name, right? So, but let us at least not label for the matter of sake. And instead, let us think an image. And I imagine in this course of thinking an image, this icon, this iconic preview picture of computer programs. Perhaps you know it. And that's in a way speaks for itself. But so in this or on this picture that I'm imagining and I'm confronted with, some kind of enclosure I'm confronted with. So there we have like the borders of the image, and kind of the content is like flat hilltops and geometrical forms, one would say, in favor, or more critically, the most impoverished sun and mountain range on Earth. Now, think, as one may say, being, residing, lingering, having your sojourn at the lake, not a river, but a lake. Draw nearer, as it were, in your inner eye, so behind your eyeballs, one could say, the situation of the lakeside being there with you and you being with the lakeside or at the lakeside. And this, the lakeside in its hem, in all that this might encompass, suggesting itself to you in the most livingly and vividly manner you can think of. Now, try to think the lake and the water the lake is spanning. Calm, quiet, still, weighted. A question one could raise is this: did you just thought the lake, the water, or was it rather a mere reflex or roaming of association, a free play of faculties, imagination? Or another way of putting this question, do all paths of thinking lead through language? Or are there other ways of thinking conceivable? Now, take the image and put it in what we may call an in-depth scene, namely being, residing, finding yourself at a lake, in the midst of this coming together. Let the one acquiesce in the arrangement, situatedness of the other. So I don't know how it is about you, but for me, it solemnly seamless blends or integrates. So the image and the in-depth scene, if you want, in this medium that seems habituated to us addressing it. So as water, intrinsically, as it were, correspond to liquidity, at least in one phase, this, what we are addressing with the notion medium, proposes itself to be fluent of spirit and source in a way. In the same vein that we spoke about an in-depth scene, let our word even out now to what may be called a swelling scene to come or to echo. Well, in every resource or spring, there's a swelling expressing with some kind of emphasis, respectively, vigor. What about and how about this swellingness or wellingness of the springing forth, the wellspring? One may say that that is an adhering of the springing to the springing forth itself. And we could rather speak of the occasion of the source, the origin, as a referring or having of a towards to fall, go down and set in terms or on the basis of a reason at a juncture. We are taken or kept away, abstained, taken apart, as it were, by the notion, and the notion is speaking of a falling together or juncture of circumstances. There is or lies the opportunity, the sense of the time or a time at which something happens, an occasioning, to find an expression for this, which is itself giving us to think. Let us be the question, how to rise to this occasion or occasioning in such a way that not only a high-flown rhetoric conjures up the swelling scene to come or to echo, but how to rise to partake of its swellingness, the swellingness of this springing forth. Where are we now with regard to in picture? Did I just say in picture? I meant to envision, but then said picture and my wires crossed. It still belongs, pertains to the same, solemnly seamless. But it deters at this juncture. It is like there'll be spells at each other in showing, taking a look, but so in granting an insight, question mark, where does this turning aside, away or down, leave us or send us to with regard to the image, the in-depth scene and the swelling scene? Is it to be conceived of as a breakdown, a misfire that as such justifiably comes under fire vested by powers? In this, that the flow of images runs dry, we might speak of an ebbing. For a split, a lickety split, the dry storm thunder ignites in the sense of a get going. The seldom that is force strikes thought, a lambency to make landfall in the archaea glossa, a language that from there on once so fluent, get about from this sea to that sea in its hustle and bustle, that the toss of flame in its delight, blossom and dying out and blossoming, in an unanimous resolution is left to the mediocre, the ordinary. Speaking of ochris, the Jack Orak Mountains, cognate with Greek ochris, the peak.
Okay.
Thanks.
Fertig. Super. Vielen Dank. Many thanks. This is a great gift you're all making me here. Vielen Dank, Leonard. Okay. Wonderful. We've got two more actually. But first, thus spake Sarubar. Go ahead.
I just want to say thank you to all of you. And I want to make a little advertisement. I just want to tell you, I don't know if you know this, but we have 2 reading groups. And I'm in both of them, and I'm uploading them also to my channel. So the first is on Sunday on 1:30 p.m. UK time. And it's being time. We are now in the second half of the book. And in the other group, we wanted to read Corbin, and yesterday we read Carl Jung's Red Book, something that I sent out. So if you're interested more in like mysticism, I don't know, more like religious stuff, philosophy of religion, Neoplatonism, if that's more like your flavor, then maybe Saturday, if you want to join, you're very welcome. Javier is also in the group, and yeah, that's just what I wanted to say. That's 1 hour earlier. That's then 12:30 p.m. UK time. Okay. I will start by evoking Heraclitus's fragment B10. In the other translation Johannes provided to us, join together a whole and not whole, bringing together itself, bursting apart and through, voices joining, voices disjoining, and out of many one, and out of one many. And the first thing we could be really struck by is that the human subject is completely absent in that sentence, because it is written in the middle voice. This is important. The Greeks were interested in how things are and not how they are for us. not from the standpoint of the subject, but from the standpoint of physis itself. And Greek, just as German, for example, allows by its grammatical structure for the construction of subjectless sentences. I found another great example in the essays in idleness, this Japanese medieval masterpiece that we also covered briefly in our idleness course. And that's the sentence goes like this, fude otoreba monokakare, which means, translated by most people, when I clasp the brush, I jot something down. But if we go literally, and this is written in the middle voice, it's just clasping the brush, the writing of something sets itself into action from itself. Perhaps you are familiar with what the poet is describing here. As soon as you pick up your pen or place your fingers above your keyboard, the writing comes forward just from itself, self-spontaneously, as if it would be the most natural thing to do, as if there is some order behind it, something. And just think about it, just that. There's no subject. We do not make this process by ourselves. It happens by itself. And that's like wow, like really, it's even what we are doing here when you think about it now, how it came about more or less by itself, how our thinking aligns itself into and gathers itself into this whatever this here is. It's almost like a little microeconomy, and it's also meaningful. It's really wow. So, in Japanese or Chinese, this is always cool. I just say this because you have a pictorial language. There, like some of the meaning is kind of like inscribed in the language in the picture, and in nature has this G, which means the self-spontaneousness. It comes out of itself. And it's so shizen is like the word, and this G is like it stands for just that the process happens by itself. Now, when the feeling of the I-hood disappears and thinking seems to just think itself, or the sayings just say themselves, this sounds very Heideggerian, then we become a place or a site where this play can happen. And then we can choose to participate or not to participate in this process. But it's important that we do not make it up by ourselves. We can hone this process of physis, or we keep it out. And I found this in a footnote of the Red Book in Jung, where he says the Faustian myth that's so pervasive in our culture with the transhumanists, so that we become those who create meaning, we become like demigods. He rejects that, and his myth was that of Philemon and Baucis, who are homing the gods, who gave themselves as mortals in a city in Phrygia, I don't know. But they are homing them in a world where God died. And then the gods disclosed themselves as gods and gave them a divine presence, divine grace. Saying this in Zen, I quote Dogen, to practice and confirm all things by conveying oneself to them as illusion, for all things to advance forward and practice and confirm the self is enlightenment. We take ourselves back, we let go, and we just let physis happen. It nourishes us with sense and meaning. The other thing that's revealed is, I think, an economy, because what is the fire doing? It's erupting out of itself, but also at the same time devouring itself and collapsing into itself. When that happens, then we have, you could say, an economical state of being, something that can persist in time. Gives a little bit of meaning in the world of impermanence. And I think that's oikonomia in the deepest sense, because then this thing, fire, is also at its right sufficiency, at its right measure. And then it's also when it's most meaningful. it discloses a certain natural order to us, where then things can roll and where they can arise and perish while radiating sense and giving sufficiency. So nature discloses her truth to us, yet she hides immediately and challenges us human beings to bear nature and to kind of like economically participate in that process. And depending on how good we do that job, how good we learn to attune ourselves, then we see also the world in its worlding and in its flourishing. And then we see sense and truth arising. And otherwise, things just collapse. So I, like, when I heard Johannes for the first time, I saw this kind of like economic motive. You know, Nietzsche, all questions are economic questions in a sense. Even in the story of the Buddha, because he's in the palace and there's no economy there. It's just like going out of hand. And Atlantis is the same topic. It's that the harbor takes everything into itself and does not let go.
2,5 Minuten.
Okay. So if we achieve that harmony, if we, and I quote again a Zen poem, if we, from the pine tree, we learn the koto, the grace, the sense-gifting element of the pine tree, and from the bamboo, we learn the koto of the bamboo. And the koto, we learn the right measure, the right economy. And we can only do this in something like Schole. And this is when you read the early Greek thinkers, this was written out of a state where this was still there. And that's why today everything's twisted in a sense. And we are at the complete opposite position to start thinking again. That was what I wanted to say.
Dankeschön nach Wien. Thank you very much. A very Schumpeterian reading. Genau, the kennst du, ne? Den Cycle beim Schumpeter. Destruction. And so, the Wiener Schmäh war da. The Viennese spirit was here. Thank you very much, Daniel. Very good. And also, just, you know, you said whatever this is. I'll just say whatever this is, it's working. So, thank you all for making whatever this is what it is. We'll figure out what it is at some point, maybe. So one more. La Squerra.
Hi, everyone. I'm not planning on doing